Dr. Bill Schindler came back on the podcast and has become a good friend, and I respect him so much as we tie together what should we be eating, how should we be living through the ancestral lens. So enjoy this conversation as we dive into a little bit about Ireland as well as a lot more. Bill, I'm so excited to be visiting with you again. Your podcast that we first did was one of my favorites. It was as I was trying to figure out ancestral eating diets, and it just really opened me up to there's a whole lot more to living than just food. While that's important, there's other components. So what have you been up to since the last time we talked? I know that you're a restaurateur now, and I'm sure you've been traveling all over the world.
You know, restaurateur, that's the first time I heard that term. We've been doing a lot. So I forget exactly what month we spoke, but a little over a year. So I know it was about a little over a year ago. A little over a year ago, we did some research in Sardinia, in the heart of the first blue zone ever identified. I hope we can dive into talking blue zones a little bit. And then we've been literally building both the nonprofit food lab and also our kitchen, or our restaurant, the Modern Stone Age Kitchen. We have like 20, 25, 26 employees now, pumping out incredible nourishing food. And I hope we can talk about that a little bit as well. And then most recently, we run a food culture prehistory tour through Ireland every year. We just got done running that tour again, and then took off right from there. Me and my wife and my oldest daughter, Brianna, and her boyfriend. We went to the Republic of Georgia, one of my favorite places in the world, and did some research on traditional cheese making. And then we also got a huge education in natural wines. I just wrote a big blog post on it on Monday, and got back about a week ago. So we've been busy, real busy.
Awesome. Well, tell me that you definitely piqued my interest on a lot of things, but the Ireland visit, according to my ancestry thing, I think I'm like 21 or 26% Irish. So what did that look like? What did the trip to Ireland expose everybody to?
Well, you know, we've been very fortunate, and it's been very concerted, conscious effort to take the family and do research all over the world. And I know we talked a little bit about this in the last podcast, but I come from an archaeological background, and all of my insight into food and diet and health initially came from looking at our ancestral diets over millions of years. But there's a lot of gaps in that knowledge, and there has to be. I mean, we're talking about understanding human diet and health through a few teeth over here and a little bit of rock over here that are a million years old. And when I started to do ethnographic field research with indigenous and traditional groups, a lot of those gaps started to get filled in. And what I realized was, number one, this was just one of the most enlightening ways to just meet other humans, incredible humans around the planet. And I wanted to share it with my family. And I also realized that I'm 51 years old now, but I'm a middle-aged, or maybe a little more than a middle-aged male at the time, doing all this work. And my access to information in a lot of these indigenous and traditional groups was limited by being a male at a certain age. There's some things I could access, but some bits of information and strategies and technologies that just wasn't available to me. So my wife or my daughter, could understand and learn and connect with women in some of these groups that were doing things that only women were allowed to do. And, my son could access things that only kids were allowed to do. So bringing the entire family has been one of the most rewarding things ever in my entire life. And it certainly transformed my view of the entire world and my place in the world and diet and health and all that. But we wanted to, it's been such incredible experiences that we wanted to find ways to share that as much as we could with other people. So certainly part of the reason I wrote the book was for that reason, and doing podcasts and blog posts and classes and things help. But actually bringing people to some of these locations is there's no substitute for it. So we started with Ireland. Ireland was a place we lived when I was writing the book. We lived there for a year. We have incredible connections there. We're linked in really strongly with a lot of the food community there, and also the archaeological community there. So we bring people, 12 people. It's for about a week. We start in Dublin. We do a lot of work front loading with a little bit of archaeology, a little bit of experimental archaeology, a lot to do with a lot of the regenerative farming that's going on in Ireland right now. Some work with local food producers. We do a little bit of seaweed foraging. And then we head off to County Mayo in the northwest coast, which is my favorite place in Ireland. And we work with some incredible people. Seamus Caulfield and his son Declan. Seamus and his father, he's 85 years old now, found the earliest complex farm system in the world. Like, these are dairy farms 6,000 years ago in Ireland. And we do a lot of that archaeology. We do amazing, and then we take these beautiful walks and foraging trips, and we connect with food, and we cook together, and we pull lobster right out of the North Atlantic, and it's amazing. And then come back, and this is fantastic. Then we come back after doing all this work with farmers and chefs and archaeologists and anthropologists and folk storytellers and all these things. We end up back in Dublin, and we're really good friends with a guy named Kevin Thornton, who was Ireland's first 2 Michelin star chef. And he creates this 2 Michelin star meal in his home for the group, and it kind of just brings everything together. But it's a wonderful way. I see my part in this community and my role in finding ways to connect people with their environment or their health or their food or their past. And that trip is a great way to do it. We're working on one to Kenya right now. We're working on one to Sardinia, and we're working on one to Oaxaca as well. But we always run the Ireland one every year.
That sounds so fun. So what is their health like? Or what is historically, because we talk a lot about like the blue zone areas, and I definitely want to get into the Sardinia aspect that you mentioned earlier. But when we look at the most Americans, right, we're going to have English or Northern European ancestry, right? And then couple that with what the work of like Doug Wallace on the mitochondrial DNA. I think that it's just really interesting to learn more about that region. So what is Ireland's like historical wellness, and what did they do? Because I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about that. And if I'm about 26%, I think it's mom's side, so the mitochondrial side might even be more important for me. What was that like?
Well, it's very interesting because, and I'm the first one to say, we are living in Stone Age bodies in a modern context, right? Our bodies are 300,000 years old, but we're living in the modern world, and there's a lot of environmental things, political things, social things that are happening all the time that impact a lot with our health, obviously, and our approach to food. Ireland's, and I don't care how remote I've been, and I know you talk with Mary Ruddick, and she's similarly has been in some incredibly remote places with incredibly remote people. I think she would agree that I've never been anywhere in the world, no matter how much of a struggle it was to get to this certain group and how remote they were, that they haven't been impacted at some level by modern life, at some level. And in some cases, it's a minor thing, but everybody's been impacted. I mean, it could take me 3 or 4 days to travel to some remote group, and somebody's wearing a Coca-Cola t-shirt somewhere. I mean, that's the world that we live in now. So we have to make sure that we do understand that as much as there's incredible information to be gained about ways people were living in the past through some of these more remote areas, everybody's been impacted at some level, and we have to realize where those impacts are. Now, Ireland is a great example of huge transformative changes to the diet because of modern things or historic things that have happened. And the Irish potato famine is a great example. It wasn't that long ago. I mean, we're talking about the mid-1800s. So very quickly, as far as Ireland is concerned, humans, just like every other mammal, the norm is to become lactose intolerant. So in other words, when we're nursing from our mothers, we're creating the enzymes, including lactase, which helps us break down the lactose to digest the milk efficiently and in an incredibly nourishing way. But when we begin to get weaned off of our mothers, just like a cow or a rat or a cat or a whale, we begin to suppress the ability to produce some of those enzymes. We just don't need them anymore. And one of the enzymes that we no longer produce is lactase that helps us break down the sugar in milk, lactose. So there were several independent genetic mutations around the world prehistorically that allowed some people to produce lactase as adults. So even after, so the norm is that animals, and believe it or not, I know people love to feed their cats milk. All animals become lactose intolerant after they get weaned, including cats. But some humans, because of the amount of dairy that was in their diets, there was a selective advantage to people that had a genetic mutation that allowed them to continue to produce lactase and tolerate lactose as adults. And some of those were in Europe, and some of those happened in Africa. And it's very interesting if you look at what we call lactase persistence today. There, about somewhere between 60 and 80% of modern humans around the world right now are lactose intolerant. 60 to 80%. That's a massive amount of people that are lactose intolerant. Some groups, like Native American groups, are almost 100% lactose intolerant. Ireland is the leading, anybody who can trace their heritage, their Irish heritage back quite a ways. Now, it's hard because, people have moved through Ireland for thousands and thousands of years, but deep Irish roots has really close to 100% lactose tolerance as adults, which really speaks to the great length of time that dairy's been in their diet and the reliance on dairy that they've had for a very long time, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So one of the cool things about going to Ireland is we're there literally in a place where 6,000 years ago, there were complex field systems set up, and there was a huge reliance on dairy. And what's really interesting about it, especially for anybody who's listened to me talk about, or anybody talk about the Samburu and the Maasai, where you have these semi-nomadic or nomadic herders, pastoralists, that are not doing any farming whatsoever, but they're reliant on things like blood and milk for the entirety of their diet. When you picture what Ireland was like 6,000 years ago with the dairy, it's probably closer to the Samburu and the Maasai than it is any other group in the world, because it's 1,000 years before grains come into Ireland. So you have these dairy farmers. There's no grains. There's no barley. There's no wheat. There's no rye. There's no oats. There's literally milk and other animal resources and some wild plants. That's what they're subsisting on. And it's there's probably a very strong case that they were consuming blood from these animals as well on a regular basis. So, but then you have this very strong heritage on dairy. Most of it would probably have been fermented dairy, and you would have had incredible cheeses and other fermented dairy products. But then the Irish, potato famine hits in the mid 1800s, and all of this traditional, not all, much of their traditional foodways begin to go away because obviously people are just worried about starving to death and surviving and feeding their kids. And then you have other parts of the world that are sending famine relief food. Like America is sending massive amounts of corn or maize to Ireland in order to help relieve some of the stresses from the famine. And all of a sudden you get this influx of maize that they never really had before in their diets, and how that transformed things. And anyhow, what also happens is they come out of the Irish potato famine, and some of the traditional foodways like seaweed. Ireland has always had a very strong tradition built around seaweed. It's an island. There's a lot of seaweed, and the coast is mostly rocky in most places, for seaweed to attach to. Tons and tons and tons of seaweed in their diet. But you can imagine coming out of the famine, one of the few things that they still could get was seaweed. So the image in their mind, in many cases, of seaweed was that was famine food. Like, that was famine food. I don't want that anymore. And, some of the traditions that did make it through the famine were then sort of discarded or forgotten about because everybody didn't want to remember those things that were happening. And unfortunately, a lot of this very strong dairy tradition is now, a lot of it is gone as well. So then, you start bringing some of the cheese. Ireland is the best place in the world to have milk. And it's the best milk in the world to make cheese. It's amazing. They have the best grass. They have amazing animals, strong tradition with cows. And then all of a sudden, there's really no strong dairy tradition anymore. Other than maybe butter, there wasn't a very strong dairy tradition. And now it's coming all back. There's amazing seaweed foragers. And some of the best chefs in the country are adopting and reintroducing seaweed on these incredible menus. And you have these incredible raw milk cheese producers all over the country making these awesome cheeses. So right now is the perfect time to look at all sorts of things, from an ancestral approach to food, how modern historical events can transform diet and health, and then now this sort of resurgence because the raw materials and resources in Ireland are incredible. So anyhow, I just absolutely love the country. I love everywhere we've been, but we have a special place in our heart for Ireland for sure.
That's absolutely fascinating. So one thing that kind of clicked relatively recent for me is kind of the role of experiencing temperature swings. Okay, so like cold or heat or different. So what is Ireland like as far as climate over the course of the seasons and stuff? And is that something that they experience a pretty good change? And then what is the correlation to the sea? Is the sea a big part of the culture, historically speaking? So the temperature and the sea.
You're asking awesome questions. I'm glad to have these are things I've never talked about on a podcast before, so I'm thrilled you're bringing it up. There's a couple of things. One is I've prided myself my entire life on being outside and being outdoors and doing all the connecting with the land and doing all this stuff. I have never in my life spent a year where I was outside as much as I was than the year we were in Ireland. It was amazing. Now, Ireland, it rains most days of the year, but it's not like the way that it rains here. It's not like, okay, it's going to rain and all of a sudden you have this deluge for 8 hours. It rains. There's some sort of precipitation almost every day, but typically it's not this huge thing that lasts for hours and hours and hours. It's a little bit of rain, then it dries out. In fact, if you were standing in Ireland watching somebody who grew up in Ireland and it starts to rain, they don't even look up. They just keep going about their day, and they know it's going to dry out in about 15 minutes, and they're going to dry out and the sun's going to come out. So, but the weather is beautiful all the time. Like, it rarely freezes and it's rarely too hot. So we were outside all the time, and there's hardly any bugs. Every now and then near the coast, when there's no wind, you'll get these no-see-em sorts of things. But there's hardly any screens in the windows. People just keep their first of all, there's hardly any air conditioners, and there's hardly any screens. People just open their windows, and there isn't this. I love Ireland, but as far as the sea's concerned, it's very interesting. There's this house. So one of the things we do on our tour, because I love. Let me back up. I taught high school for 1 year. I taught college for over 20 years, and I saw my role as a teacher. Sort of my teaching philosophy was that I want to share with my students the way that I see the world. And I want them to be able to take that and incorporate that into the way, not to replace the way they see the world, but to incorporate that to augment the way that they perceive the world. It's kind of like, if you ever wondered, I think about this all the time, like an amazing woodworker, what do they look at when they see a tree? Or what does a sculptor see when they see a rock, right? I want to take and how I see the world and allow the students to be able to see the world through my eyes as well, to augment the way that they already do. And I love experiences where I thought I had something figured out, and then somebody's shown me by the way that they see the world that, there's a lot more to learn. So there's this house. So County Mayo, northwest coast of Ireland, absolutely one of my most beautiful places in the world. In fact, the Appalachian Mountains run through there from when the continents, broke away. Beautiful North Atlantic, gorgeous, rugged coastline, beautiful bogs, wonderful. There is on one of the areas that we spend a lot of time, again, one of those scenic views I've ever seen in my life. And I have been incredibly fortunate to travel all over the world. This is one of the most scenic views in the world. There's a house. It's an old stone house that is, partially fallen down. I forget how old it is, a couple hundred years, and all built by hand. And if you go to the house and stand and look at the view, you're like, I know why they put this house there. Because this is the most beautiful view in the entire world. But when you look at the house, something really strange appears. The wall that's facing, the stone wall built by hand, this wall that's facing this incredible view has 0 windows, none whatsoever. The wall facing away from the most beautiful view in the world is loaded with windows. And you look at that, like, what the heck? is that about? It's the exact opposite. And Seamus, who's that archaeologist I mentioned, one of my favorite people in the world, talks about the difference between landscape and scenery. One is what's there, and one is how you experience that landscape. And he tells the story of the family. He knows of the family that had built this house. And the family that built this house come from the Shetland Islands, and I have part of this story wrong, but they, I believe, lost two sons to the sea who were fishermen. And it's a like in your face example of, when I look at that ocean, I see beauty. When they looked at that ocean, they saw fear and loss and dread and misery, wow. Right? And it was reflected in how they built this house. But it's one of these incredible examples of their relationship with the sea is completely different for a number of different reasons, and maybe yours or mine are because of the way that we experience that particular scene or that particular landscape. So all that is to say, you actually, in Ireland, there was a big push when we lived there several years ago to teach people how to swim. And, here's an island. It's literally an island. You'd think everybody would know how to swim, but it was actually, a lot of people didn't learn how to swim on purpose because there was this idea that if the sea was supposed to take you, that it was supposed to take you. Like you weren't supposed to buck, what was supposed to happen. And people didn't know how to swim. You have these fishermen out on these curraghs in the North Atlantic, fishing for salmon in these huge waves and didn't even know how to swim. But now a lot of that relationship has changed. There's also, in Ireland, there was this really interesting relationship with the seafood resource. Incredible fishing all around Ireland. But fish wasn't a huge part of the diet, at least, historically it wasn't. And now it's starting to become that way again. So a lot of the fish that was caught in the coast around Ireland was getting exported to other places. And all that is to say that you have this incredibly complex relationship between natural resources, food, diet, health, that have all these things that are happening all at the same time. Historical events, religion, traditions, all of these things impacting the way that people are using the resources around them, and that obviously in turn impacts their health and a lot of other things. I love Ireland. It's amazing.
How cool. No, that's definitely got to go on the visit list. So, surprised that they don't eat a lot of seafood. I was... They're
doing it more now. A lot more now.
But ancestrally speaking or historically speaking, it wasn't a massive thing. Because when you started talking... Well, you mentioned
one thing very quickly, because I don't want to mess up. Prehistorically, there was a lot of fish consumption. I mean, okay. We think about this idea of hunter-gatherers. Most of Ireland was probably prehistorically, pre-dairy, fisher-gatherers.
Okay.
So fish was an incredibly important resource prehistorically. Dairy comes in, then grains come in. And then you have a lot of historical things happening. And there seems to be, and I'm not an Irish historian by any means, there is a gap of not using a lot of at least the fish resources for a while. But right now, for a number of different reasons, fish is really becoming much more of a consumed thing for sure. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but I want to make sure I got that right.
No, you're good. The component of vitamins and minerals, the DHA, all the things that come potentially from the sea. I was trying to gauge where, ancestrally speaking, those things fit the bill of what, the ideas I've constructed about my ancestry go. How important is it for, say, a modern person that has that influence to be eating more of an ancestral way that is, from our past? Because, Bill, one thing that I am getting more and more to is that local and seasonal and natural foods really need to be the guidelines, right? And for me in Arkansas, winter there's nothing growing, right? There's not a whole lot of stuff I can go out there to eat plant-wise. And so almost by default, winter's really a carnivore diet, if we're thinking back ancestrally speaking, or if you're able to have the preservatives, ferments or whatever. And so like where I was going with that was What did that look like for my, 12 times great grandparents in Ireland? What were they doing, and what were they sourcing, and just curious.
I think, and whether it's Ireland or somewhere else, I think we can say the same things because every part of the world experiences some sort of changing in seasons, right? We experience it in different ways, right? In some parts of the world, it's between the wet and the dry season. And in some parts of the world, it's like where we have here, where we have winter, spring, summer, fall. But there's always fluctuations in something that impacts the resources that are available to us and when they're available to us and that sort of thing. I was just talking about this the other day. I think my role in this space is as somebody who connects. I want to connect people to themselves, their families, their community, their environment, and their past. And I think when we are able to do that to the right level, a lot of the questions that we're asking on a daily basis aren't questions anymore. We can answer them ourselves. And I think because of the way that we've disconnected ourselves from our food and where it comes from and allowed other people to fill in that space and manipulate us and tell us what they want so they can make more money and that sort of thing, we're left almost defenseless. And one of the things that happens when we get completely disconnected and we have this modern industrial food system that's kind of stepped in is we've lost a lot of the limiting mechanisms that have kept certain things from becoming issues in the past. So a great example is if you were eating Hyperseasonal and Hyperlocal, which is exactly what was happening for the millions of years that we've been on this planet up until recent times, where we have sort of this global food system where we're shipping things all over the world and growing them all year round and freezing them and doing all these sorts of things. And then we have lost a lot of those limiting mechanisms. And here's a few very good examples, I think. Spinach is a great one. Right? First of all, spinach is a modern plant. Like we have genetically modified a wild plant through selective pressure. It's become spinach, and we're growing this now. But spinach is super high in oxalates, and it's actually one of the biggest offenders of having high oxalate levels. I don't eat it at all anymore, but just because of my issues with oxalates. But spinach would never have been a problem if you only ate the spinach the several weeks out of the year you were growing it in your yard, right? And then you'd have maybe a higher level of oxalates in your diet for a few weeks, and all of a sudden you're not eating spinach anymore because it wasn't growing again until the following year. But we've taken that away. That limiting mechanism of seasonality with spinach is now gone, and we have it in the grocery stores 365 days out of the year as fresh and also as frozen. And then on top of that, we have this, because we don't know about growing food anymore, most of us, and we don't know what we should be eating. We're looking to other people and like, oh, spinach is a superfood. You should be eating it every day and have a spinach shake in the morning and a spinach salad at lunch. And all of a sudden we've created a problem that wasn't there before. Same sort of thing with nuts. I love nuts. I love the taste of nuts. I love the texture of nuts. I love everything about nuts. And most of them are loaded with oxalates as well. And again, if you had to go out and find the tree that had the nuts, collect all these nuts, take the hull off, and then shell the nuts, and then pick the nut meats out of the shell, and then probably go ahead and roast them as well. You're talking about a major investment in time and energy, and you'd have a little bit in return. So the nuts that you would be eating is at a low amount. But now we can go to BJ's or Costco or a big box store and get a big bag of shelled almonds. They're telling us almonds are a superfood, and we can get that for $11 and go home and just start popping almonds anytime we have a craving for something. We've created a problem that was not there in the past. Most recently, actually, as of last night, I'm reading this fantastic book called The Drunken Monkey. And it's about, there's an anthropologist at the University of California, Berkeley, who has come up with this hypothesis. I believe, I forget when he did, maybe 2014, 2015, but it's called the Drunken Monkey Hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that, and he does a lot of work with primates, and he started noticing in this field research that these primates were purposely selecting for fruits that were in the process of fermentation. Like fermenting, like fruits that were spontaneously fermenting on their own. They're full of sugar. They're loaded with wild yeast already. They'll spontaneously ferment and create alcohol, and that were drawn from a very deep ancestral place to alcohol. But there's only so much, and his other part of the hypothesis is it serves nutritional purposes to be able to seek out this fruit, that there's a lot of advantages to fruit that's in the process of fermenting as opposed to just the ripe fruit itself, which is very interesting. And he lays all this out. But kind of the most important takeaway from the conversation is we would have only had access to a certain amount of fermenting fruit at any given time. And if we have this propensity towards seeking it out, now we can walk into a liquor store and load our truck with all sorts of alcohol, and we've taken away those limiting mechanisms, and now we have issues with things like alcoholism and the like that would have never been a problem before in the past. So that connection, that eating hyperlocal, hyperseasonal, the way that our ancestors did, immediately solves a whole host of problems. And I'll give you really quick one other sort of more modern Irish example. So there's a good friend of mine, his name is Cian Foley, and he wrote a book several years ago called Don't Eat for Winter. And here he was in his late 30s, overweight, unhealthy, and he lived near Waterford in Ireland, and he was sitting there, I think it was in middle of December, it was middle of winter, and he was eating an apple. And he was standing at his kitchen window, and he's looking out his kitchen window, and he's eating an apple, and he looks out, and he happened to have an apple tree in his front yard. And he thinks to himself, man, I'm eating this apple, and there's no apples on that tree. And then there's not even any leaves on this tree, and here I am eating this apple. And he, at that moment, decided that there was something about eating seasonal that was very important. So the only thing that he changed in his diet was that he was going to eat hyperlocal, hyperseasonal. That's it. And only eat things that were in season in his part of the world when they were in season. And here he is, years later, he's won several drug-free bodybuilding championships. He's a world kettlebell champion. The guy is in amazing health and an amazing shape. But there's several takeaways from this. Number one, what he posited, or one of his ideas, was that the plant resources that are available in the late summer and in the fall are loaded with carbohydrates. They're there, and they put weight on animals so that they can overwinter. So his idea of eating for winter is eating these high carbohydrate foods in the late summer and fall, and then you put on all this fat or all this weight. So his idea was he's not eating for winter. He's only going to eat hyperlocal, which I think was very interesting. And he's right. I mean, that is, you start your starch-rich underground storage organs like potatoes and like that, those are loaded with starch at the end of the summer and the early fall. And then fruits and apples and those sorts of things. So that was very interesting. The second thing that was very interesting, and again, it's one of these worldview changing sorts of things. I grew up a very overweight kid, but I'd always get muscle and fitness magazines all the time, and I'd look at, Lee Haney and Rich Gaspar and all these bodybuilders at the time, and they're down to like whatever percent body fat. I'm like, that is exactly how I want to be, and I want to be like that all year round, and whatever. I've never completely reached it, but that's the idea I had in my head. And he was like, whoa. He said, look, that's wrong. That's the wrong way to think about it, because if we are truly eating seasonally, our body fat percentage, just like every other animal, should fluctuate as well. It is just as unnatural to be at 5% body fat 365 days out of the year as it is to be 30% body fat 365 days out of the year. So he says, look, my body fat changes all year round. He says, as soon as the end of the summer and the fall come, I'm eating fruits, I'm eating potatoes, I'm eating all these things, and his body fat rises. And then come into the spring, he's overwintering and he's lost all that body fat. He goes through the summer very low, and then he goes back up again. And I thought that was a very interesting way to think about it, because I would imagine most people listening to this are of the mindset like I was, that we need to be at whatever percent body fat and be like that 365 days out of the year. But is that ancestrally appropriate? Probably not.
Fascinating. That is an approach that I've not thought about. The local, the seasonal, and then the natural. So can you go into a little bit of that? So by natural food, my definition is more akin to what it was, say, 100 plus years ago. Like just to kind of have a break off. Because when we look at, say, a banana, which is not going to grow in Arkansas, right? It'd be a source of food for anybody. So probably, in my view, shouldn't be eating it at all. But what does a banana, for example, for 200 years ago look like compared to the banana of the day? I think this is the part where when I say natural, people don't have any idea. I think they mean it doesn't have glyphosate on it, right? But it means more like its natural state. So what does that mean to you?
It's a complicated question with a more complicated answer, but I'll do my best. First off, just because we're talking about Ireland and you mentioned bananas, Ireland is the clearinghouse for bananas in Europe. So almost all bananas that end up anywhere in Europe come green, immature, into Ireland, I believe into Cork, and then they get gassed in because in order to make the journey, right, you don't want them to get bruised or anything, so they ship them green and hard. Then they get gassed there, they turn yellow, and then they get shipped to the other places. And what's very interesting is we have so many friends in Ireland that are my age that remember when the first banana came into Ireland. Like, I grew up with bananas my entire life. My parents they remember when the first banana came to Ireland, and it was a very, very big deal. I think we forget how new a lot of these foods are, and we walk into the produce section of the grocery store, and we just think natural, right? This is natural. This is, if I'm going to eat a diet like my great-great-grandparents did, this is where I start. And most of the things that are in there, your great-great-grandparents would never recognize. Yeah. And if they did, it would look a lot different than the way that they look now. Here's a couple of very interesting things about that. Number one, we need to recognize that every single plant in the grocery store and at a farmer's market that we have commercially available to us are domesticated plants. None of them are wild. I mean, unless you're in some really cool area that has a forager that brings stuff to the farmer's market, they're all domesticated. So every domesticated plant in the world has a wild ancestor. So there was a wild plant growing that at some point humans took and started to take care of. And even then, whether it's happening 10,000 years ago or 10 years ago, they were genetically modifying these plants. Now, genetically modifying 10,000 years ago and genetically modifying now are night and day different things, but they're still serving a purpose. And here's an example of a unintentional genetic modification. So, for example, let's say you're a hunter-gatherer somewhere 40,000 years ago, and you find a patch of some sort of fruit. And some of that fruit just happens to be bigger. There's a genetic mutation that happened. So maybe 10% of the fruits that are here have this genetic mutation where they're bigger and their seeds are a little bit smaller, and maybe they're a little bit sweeter. Those are the ones that I want. So out of this population of all of these wild fruits, with 10% of them having this genetic mutation where they're bigger and they're sweeter and the seeds are smaller, you only grab those fruits. Those are the only ones that you ate. So you ate those fruits right there. So 100% of the fruits that you ate had this genetic mutation. Then you went back to your camp 2 miles away. The next morning you got up and you went to the bathroom. So when you went to the bathroom, all that came out of you, plus the seeds from inside of that fruit, in a pile of fertilizer. The following year, that plant grows, and damn close to 100% of the fruits that are there in that location now that were deposited by you are bigger, sweeter, and have smaller seeds. That's genetic modification. You've just changed the genetic population of that particular area. And those are the ones you continue to propagate and that sort of thing. So we've been genetically modifying plants on purpose and by mistake for a very, very, very long time. Genetic modification now for like glyphosate resistant maize, that's a completely different thing. But my point is that the fruits and the vegetables that are in the grocery store today have been selected by humans for a variety of purposes. Now, in the past, we would have maybe selected for certain things that could have been beneficial to our health. But most of the things that we're selecting for today are negative to our health. Right? First of all, they're probably a heck of a lot sweeter than they ever were before. And quite often, there's a fantastic book called Eating on the Wild Side. Came out, I forget how many years ago. It's worth the read. It's awesome. But it talks about some of the major domesticated plants in the world today, everything from onions to apples, and how we've genetically modified them over time, and how much sweeter they are, how much less nutrients there are in them anymore. I think I have to go with the numbers right now, but you have to eat like 5 apples today to get the same amount of nutrition that 1 apple our grandfather would have contained. So they're completely different. Another thing to keep in mind too, and this is very important because I just spent a lot of time researching and studying and talking about plant toxins. The cool thing about fruit is that fruit is one of the few parts of the plants that the plant wants to attract you to. I mean, the role of the fruit is to attract an animal to eat the fruit, and then the seeds go through their digestive tract and get dumped in a pile of manure somewhere, and the species gets propagated. However, that only, and this is very important for people to understand, that means that fruit that's ripe has rarely any toxins in it whatsoever. It can, depending on the plant, but rarely does it have any toxins. It's incredibly safe to eat from a toxin perspective. Oh, sorry about that. But that only counts for ripe fruit, because it doesn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective for an animal to eat the fruit before the seeds are mature. So if you look at a lot of wild plants, a great example, there's a huge toxin load in that fruit until it's ready, until the seeds are mature. So by me, American persimmon is a great example. If you ate an unripe persimmon, you would never eat another persimmon the rest of your life because the seeds aren't ready. But as soon as that is fully ripe and the seeds are mature, the toxin gets turned off, and it is my favorite fruit in the entire world. It's literally night and day. That is the case with fruits in general. So there is a higher toxin load in a green banana than there is in a perfectly ripe banana. And some things that I don't know about, but I think are important in the conversation is, just like when I mentioned, we're shipping green bananas all over the world so that they don't bruise, for somebody to make money on them. I mean, this is why these decisions have been made. And then they're gassed and sort of artificially matured. Are they? Like, I don't know this answer, but I know that the toxin load in a green banana, an unripe banana, is a lot higher than it is in a fully mature, ripe banana. Is a artificially forced, gassed, unripe banana, has it actually served its purpose in fully detoxifying that banana? I don't know. I do know that the fruits today are 1,000 times sweeter than they were in the past. I ate a wild orange about 5 years ago. I ate a wild orange. A wild orange is about the size of your pinky nail. It's the smallest thing ever. And I ate that, and you can eat it kind of like a kumquat, like eat the whole thing. It was the most bitter, non-sweet thing. It had the orange flavor. It had the orange flavor on steroids, but it wasn't sweet. It was bitter. You wouldn't eat many of them. It is nothing like an orange today. And if we're trying to do this sort of, okay, I'm eating in an ancestrally appropriate way, and our ancestors were eating fruit, and they were eating fruit, then I can go ahead and eat my oranges and my apples and my bananas. But we're talking about two completely different foods, right? And we do have to keep that in mind. And the three biggest issues with fruits today and produce in the grocery store in general is, number one, it's a lot sweeter than it was in the past. So it has a lot more sugar. It also has less nutrients in it than it did certainly in the past. And we've also it doesn't have the same, it's not grown in the same way. It's not harvested in the same way. It's not processed in the same way. So there's a whole bunch of things that are limiting our ability to get all that nutrition from those plants, that if we were living in a traditional society and fermenting the proper way, or drying, or doing whatever. Quinoa is a fantastic example. I was in Bolivia doing research on potatoes, and I didn't even mean to learn anything about quinoa. But the Aymara family I was living with up in the Altiplano brought some quinoa out someday, because they grow quinoa. And we were talking about processing it. And one of the toxins that quinoa has in it is saponins. And the saponin content in quinoa is so high that the first time they wash it to detoxify it, they take all of that liquid that comes off of it, and that's what they wash their clothes in. The saponin level is so high that they use it as laundry detergent. I mean, it's off the charts. So we have all these foods in our, we're so disconnected from this. We have all these foods in our conscious, because they're talking about it from a health food perspective here. The doctor's saying this, the nutritionist is saying this, and this is advertised as the new superfood over here. But the reality is, we are listening to somebody else filter all this information for their own gain, and we're thinking we're doing something we should be doing, but we're actually in many cases making ourselves sick.
Absolutely. I love the way that you broke that out. I was going through and thinking what would have been available here in Arkansas for a very short time. It would have been persimmon pawpaw. I
Yeah.
really can't think of another fruit, honestly, just offhand. I'm sure there are more, but that's it. So when 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 I give that advice, right, of local, seasonal, natural, honestly, for the most part, the only thing that really fits that bill, like honestly, is carnivore. It really is. Unless somebody's going to forage, right, and
Mhm.
knows what they're doing. I think carnivore is literally the only way that in 2024 that we can do this by the local, seasonal, and natural. So what are your thoughts with that? I mean, am I crazy for thinking like that, or is there something to it? And how do you see across Ireland or Sardinia or any of these places where the agricultural practices are actually positive for the community and health, right? Like not we're not destroying everything. So am I crazy for thinking carnivore has a lot of merit, and how can we apply that to the practices in which we raise livestock?
I agree with you. Carnivore has an incredible amount of merit. I would add that to me, the most, and I know there are some people in the carnivore community that would completely disagree with me, but the most, to me, the most ancestrally appropriate, nourishing, sustainable, ethical, and even economic approach to carnivore is an entirely whole animal approach, period. It has to include the entire animal. It has to include organs. It has to include fat. It has to, when possible, skin, blood, whatever. I mean, that is, and dairy, fermented dairy more than anything. I'm a huge raw milk advocate, but I'm a stronger advocate of fermented raw milk.
Okay.
So I think things like kefir, yogurt, raw milk cheeses, that sort of thing, I think are fantastic. I agree with Vinny Tortorich. I don't know if you saw his new documentary. It's actually pretty good. Have you seen it?
Uh,
Dirty Keto. It's good. It's really good. Um, but he is in there with the honey thing is kind of silly. And now I like honey. I love honey. I think there's a lot of benefits to honey. If you're going on carnivore because part of what you're looking to accomplish is to have a low carb diet, the honey doesn't like fit into that very well just because it comes from an animal. I would also say, and I know there's a lot of people that would disagree with me here, but I would also say that an ancestrally appropriate diet also includes insects. And I know this is a huge hot topic right now, and it's the point of contention in so many. But some of the arguments that have been created for us, actually from some of the leaders in the carnivore community, it's like, don't tell me to eat bugs. You're taking away my meat. I'm sure there are people that out there that are suggesting we eat bugs in place of meat. But to me, if you're truly looking at the archaeological record and the information we have from it and what our ancestors were eating before we started eating meat, while we were eating meat, and what most indigenous and traditional groups around the world still continue to eat today are insects. They're there all the time. And the same things when we're talking about other animals, the ability, like you said, from a local and seasonal perspective, animals are always in Arkansas, right? So animals in the past have always been in our diet all year round because they're always there. Not certainly some animals are migrating, but there's always animals somewhere that you can eat. So meanwhile, you have plants that are growing or not there, or poisonous this time of the year, whatever. The animals are always there. So are insects. Insects, so from the consistency throughout the year to have access to insects, it's there. The protein and fat content in insects is absolutely incredible. And if you want to start to get into some of the conversations about sustainability and the like, they are incredibly sustainable to not only harvest, but also to farm. So I wish the conversation right now wasn't insects or meat. I wish it was insects and meat, which is kind of where we land. As far as the other thing that really throws a wrench into some of this is, yes, like let's take Arkansas, for example. what resources are available to us that would be in line with our ability, in line with kind of our ancestral approaches, right? It's sort of what you're saying. But I'd also add, if we're really trying to dive down, it's much more complicated than that, because if we're really trying to think about it, if we're talking about what resources are available, about any technologies whatsoever, these are kind of there. That's great. But we also would need to strip away things like houses and air conditioners and heaters and our clothes and our shoes and everything else. And really what you're left with is Arkansas is not fit for a human. Arkansas, Canada, Maine, I don't care where we are, most places in the world are not fit for humans to survive in any form 365 days out of the year. I mean, there's a very, it shouldn't be a surprise that until we started developing things like fire and shelter and clothing, we never left Africa. Like we couldn't leave a certain part of Africa because we couldn't literally protect ourselves from the elements until we started creating these technologies. So the reality is nobody should be living in Arkansas without technologies. Or we can't live in Arkansas without technology. You can't live in New Jersey without technologies. You can't live in most of these places. So when we have these conversations, I do think we have to sort of navigate, or at the same time, all these complexities of what does it mean to be a human today? What technologies are there that actually nourish us, that keep us safe? And what technologies are in place that do the opposite, whether it's food or the like. So I do like to look into the past for all of my foundational information about how we should be nourishing ourselves, 100%. And when you do that, animal-based foods are certainly at the top. Insects are at the top. Plants, when they're there, are carefully selected and highly processed in order to detoxify them and make the nutrients in them more available to us. We were always eating seasonally. We were always eating locally. And depending on where you are in the world, those seasons change, certainly. But just eating locally and seasonally means, by default, things are coming into your diet at certain times of the year and leaving your diet at certain times of the year. You are getting things that aren't traveling very far. You're supporting local farmers. You're supporting your local community. You're supporting your local economics. You're doing all these wonderful things that accomplish so many aspects of our lives that we really need to do a better job with. And whether or not spinach grows well in Arkansas or how many weeks it does, even if you just ate the spinach when it grew in Arkansas, you'd be doing yourself a huge favor compared to getting into BJ's and Costco all year round. So, I know it's not a direct answer, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's incredibly complicated. I look to the past for, we say one of the taglines of the Food Lab is informed by the past, inspired by the future. And the idea is we get all this incredible information from the past, and it's valuable information. And we're inspired to use that information to transform our health, our community, our relationship with the world, because we know we have to do that going into the future. Like, we have to make changes. But it's not as easy as taking this from 2 million years ago and sticking it in Arkansas or Maryland. We have to keep in mind that we are living in 300,000-year-old bodies, but in 2024, with all of those other things that are happening that influence our health and our ability to do whatever we're doing in our lives. So again, it's complicated, but I think it's the right way to get a foundation for how we're supposed to feed ourselves is looking into the past, for sure.
Well, no, I love that. And I feel like it was a great answer. Something I want to get, as we wrap up, your thoughts on were, when you think about all the places that you've traveled and the people you've been around, would you agree or disagree that most of them would spent time outside? A lot of them, a large percentage of the time they spent it outside. They had contact with nature, whether that's the ground or plants or just how they lived, and they were happy or communal.
Yes, and absolutely 100% across the board. And I rarely say 100. I rarely say always or never, because as soon as you say always or never, you're almost always wrong. But in this case, yes, all the time. And I'll give maybe to close this out, I'll give a Sardinian example for, again, this blue zone example. We ended up in Sardinia not by mistake. We ended up in Sardinia because there were certain things I was conducting research on. One of them was an ancient form of detoxification of acorns for a very ancient bread. And the other was because there was this cheese making tradition we were trying to research with these shepherds in the mountains. And we ended up, it took me 8 years to make the contacts to get into where I wanted to go. And one of the people I got in contact with a few years ago is a woman named Gisela Rubiu. And she is a Sardinian native who's also a food historian. And she lives in this village of Villa Grande, which is the epicenter of the first blue zone ever identified. And we made our inroads through her. She's wonderful. And we lived with certain families there. We cooked together. We ate together. This is what we experienced all the time. And here we are. I have prided myself for the past decade on making all the food my family has eaten entirely from scratch. And when I mean scratch, I mean fully from scratch. We make the cheese. We do the butcher. We do it 100%. And we founded our restaurant on the same principle. So there's no two ingredients put together outside of our walls. We make everything. If you come in here and you get a sandwich, we made 100% wild, long fermented sourdough bread. We made all the cheese. We made all the condiments. We made all the meats, all of it, 100% from scratch. That's what I have experienced for the past decade or so of my life. When we went to Sardinia, every house we were in was a humbling experience for me because that was the norm. Like not only did they make everything from scratch, but they sourced all of their ingredients. They grew or raised every ingredient that they had. Like I would say every meal that we ate, we sat at a table, and it could be a very simple meal or it could be a 7-course meal. All the food that was served was raised, harvested, butchered, cooked, fermented, whatever, by somebody sitting in that room. I mean, it was unbelievable. They didn't even have farmers markets. What they had instead were this is a little village on the side of a mountain. They had plots of land that were communal, but they were sort of segregated into, for different families. And this is where the pigs were raised and the chickens lived and their orchard was and all of it. I've never seen anything like it, experienced anything like it in my life. There were no questions. One of the things that I say when I talk about going to the blue zone is that from a modern perspective, what we would expect to see in a village or a town where it has one of the oldest living populations in the world, you would expect to see, according to our standards, a whole bunch of nutritionists, a whole bunch of doctors, a whole bunch of gyms, and a whole bunch of retirement homes, right, for all the old people. And you saw none of that. Like none of that was there because nobody needed a nutritionist because they had no questions about their food. They had no questions. They were by default eating hyperseasonal, hyperlocal, making everything entirely from scratch. There were no preservatives, there were no additives, there was nothing. The second thing is you didn't need a gym. Now, nobody there looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but everybody had muscle tone. Everybody was in shape, and because they were always moving. Like they were always moving. They were always walking up and down the mountains. They were moving around, harvesting, doing all these things. You didn't need retirement homes because these people weren't dying into their hundreds. They were living into their hundreds. They were thriving into their hundreds. The man in the house next door to the house we stayed at the longest, he was 103 years old. He lived on the second floor of the house next door to us, and he walked up and down the steps multiple times a day. Like it was unbelievable. It was very common to just see a couple in their hundreds walk up the side of the mountain, for a daily walk in the evening and then come back down. I mean, it blew my mind. But what was most, I think, telling or most the biggest takeaway from all this was I actually asked them. And in fact, the family we're living with was the subject of a BBC special about the blue zones a while ago. So they knew that this blue zone thing was a thing. It wasn't hidden from them. And I asked them, I said, okay, seriously, I know this is cliche, but what's the secret? I mean, what is it? I mean, I experienced a diet there. The diet that we experienced was the exact opposite of anything that's suggested about the blue zones. I mean, literally percentages flip. The amount of animal-based foods and plant-based foods are the exact opposite of what Dan Butner and what Netflix is suggesting. Completely opposite. But I said, okay, so what's the secret? Like, seriously, what's the secret? And the answer, they looked right at me and they said, we're kind. And I said, wait, no, I'm sure, what's the answer to living long? They said, we're kind. And I'm like, you know what? You are kind. Like, people just sat and talked and conversed and walked with one another. It was absolutely wonderful. So I would say the combination, everything that came together that made, certainly there's never one thing that, makes it. It's a combination of things. They're kind. The people were just genuinely kind. The second thing is they were viscerally connected with every aspect of their food. They grew it, they raised it, they harvested it, they butchered it, they fermented it, they cooked it. Everything on the table, they know everything about. They are always exercising. They're always moving. And there is, just to throw it out there, there's a type of wine that from the area that some people are suggesting conveys a whole bunch of health benefits. And it is a very common wine in Sardinia. I don't know if that has anything to do with it or not, but the wine is absolutely delicious. So I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I love the talks again, my friend. Thank you for taking the time and sharing your experience. We've got to get a plug for the restaurant. So tell us all about where it's located and how people can learn more.
Awesome. Thank you for the opportunity to do that. We're very proud of what we're building here. So we have two entities here in Chestertown, Maryland. So we're located on the eastern shore of Maryland, which is the east side of the Chesapeake Bay. Nice, rural, historic, quaint, beautiful area. We're about an hour from Washington, D.C., about an hour and a half from Philadelphia, and about 3 hours from New York City. So if you're in any of those areas, please come and visit us. Take a day trip out. We have our restaurant, the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, which all of our research, all of our archaeological and ethnographic work has literally been transformed into recipes. And we use all these recipes to nourish the community. So we make everything entirely from scratch. We don't use any industrial nut or seed oils. We don't use any refined sugars. All of our grains are fully wild, long fermented sourdough. We butcher local animals. We use the entire animal. And I think what's incredibly important, I know that we sat there and talked about, some crazy foods today, including insects, which we do have some insects on the menu, I will be honest. But our mission with the restaurant is to make familiar food as nourishing as it can be. So you certainly can walk into our restaurant and order something crazy, but most of what our menu is incredibly familiar to you. I mean, we have pizza and we have sandwiches and we have waffles and we have croissants. We have all these, but they're literally the most nourishing forms of all of these foods. So that's what we do downstairs, and we're very, very proud of it. We have I think 26 people working now creating all this food. It's wonderful. We also have a nonprofit called the Food Lab, and through that nonprofit, we continue to conduct research. We do a lot of educational outreach. We do school programs. We do a lot of adult classes. We do all sorts of classes from cheese making to butchering to sourdough, and the list goes on. And we do that in person here at the Food Lab. We do them online. We have on-demand and downloadable classes as well. So if you have any questions and want to learn more about how to nourish your family, that's the resource. So on the internet website, it's modernstoneagekitchen.com, and then everything else from our blog to information about the nonprofit, it's eatlikeahuman.com. And you can follow us online at Modern Stone Age Kitchen and also at Dr. Bill Schindler, so at Dr. Bill Schindler.
I love it. Love it. Love what you're doing. Love the work that you've put out, and appreciate you, my friend.
Hey, likewise. So good to see you, and thanks for the opportunity to share what we've been up to the past year.
Of course.
Thank you for joining us in the Sowing Prosperity mission. If you like this content, like and subscribe, share with your friends. Be sure to check out sowingprosperity.com. Sign up for the email. We've got so much more work to do.